Good morning. On behalf of Colombia Freedom of Expression, it is a pleasure to welcome you to this webinar called Journalism Under Surveillance in Latin America, Cases, Challenges, and Responses from the Human Rights Point of View. Colombia Freedom of Expression was founded in 2014 and gathers experts and activists worldwide together with the university to identify the challenges faced by freedom of expression in the different countries and regions, and at the same time provide access to national and international case law on the most sensitive issues for freedom of expression so that they can use for investigation, lawsuits, and making it visible for the exercising of these rights. Our main initiative is the Bank of World Case Law, a free resource for different stakeholders working in the field of freedom of expression. It is worth pointing out the spatial collection papers where we systematize and analyze case law on different topics such as right to oblivion, violence against journalists, surveillance and privacy, transparency and access to information slacks, protests, humor, or moderation of content. To this, we have to add a great academic work through seminars and presentations of paradigmatic cases to defend those who face justice as a result of exercising their right to freedom of expression, such as the case of Mauricio Weibel, who will be in this panel, and he was invited for today. This program is a space that belongs to all the people who believe that the right to freedom of expression is the basis of robust democracy. This webinar is essential for debate on the challenging risks to freedom of expression in our region. We feel honored to have Claudia Julieta Duque. She is a journalist and human rights defender specializing in investigation on impunity, paramilitarism, violence, and armed conflict. Her work has been recognized and she holds different awards. Mauricio Webil Barahona, he is an investigative journalist from the University of Chile, and Juan Manuel Ospina Sanchez, he is a legal researcher and our specialist in freedom of expression, and who will be moderating this panel. This webinar will be 1 hour and a half long. It is open to the public, and we have people helping us from different parts of Latin America, providing support. This webinar will be streamed through the YouTube channel on the channel called Freedom of Expression. And the chat will be open for comments and questions. You can use the chat on Zoom. At the same time, there is interpretation into English for those who need it, and this can be activated from the Zoom menu. So without further ado, we will start this conversation. Welcome and thank you for being here today. So now I will give the floor to Mauricio Webel. Welcome, Mauricio. Thank you, Alejandra. Thank you, Stefania. Well, I will share this case. This is a case of military espionage in the framework of my investigations of military corruption in Chile. I will tell you what this case is about so that we can make a brief analysis on different legal aspects and to conclude with the consequences. In 2015, I started investigating military corruption in Chile on weapons, the acquisition of weapons in Chile. This investigation at that point resulted in the investigation of 800 military as a result of different cases of corruption, and high-ranking officers, including them. Uh, the, this showed the corruption for the acquisition of weapons through a secret law. this investigation created a huge impact, and this meant that every year they stopped receiving approximately $2 billion for the purchase of weapons. So, in the last 4 years, the nation received like a huge amount of money, approximately $10 billion for social services. In my investigation for different newspapers, we were aiming at commanders and high-ranking officers in the military, and the intelligence division decided to cooperate on espionage. Actually, there were different signs of very clear espionage. They had assaulted the newspaper where I was working, so it was evident that garbage but was being checked. And well, this they decided to do this using the intelligence law that anyway, even if they are not allowed, just to fight drug trafficking and for national security, but not for corruption, let alone journalism. So in order to do this, they allied a judge from the appellate court, from higher instances, and they decided to counterfeit the orders of wiretapping, and this was not reviewed, and they included the name of a young lady of approximately 24, 25 years old. She was a single mom. Okay, so they accept she was a migrant from Bolivia, so they really accepted they had done this, and evidently we didn't know, we were not aware of this until 2017 or 2019 when an intelligence agent decided to reveal this. So there was a social outbreak in Chile, the pandemic, and the lawyers participating in the case, my colleague and myself, decided to begin legal proceedings because this espionage operation, besides being supported by this president of the appellate court, was defended by ministers of defense before the Congress. So three ministers of defense were defending this espionage operation. So in that case, we decided to start the investigations. I'm not going to bore you about this, but we were able to identify all the intelligence agents who have participated together with the prosecutor's office. We were able to identify all the frauds and the different operations. And today we are about to begin the last part of the legal process on October the 15th. We will have to present the evidence, and this is a very special moment because the prosecutor's office decided to request 20 years of prison for the general and for the judge. So this is really important. They are not all being accused by the main ones in these operations are being accused. This is a case which was kind of complicated because at some point it was really hard to arrest the judge because there were some members of the Supreme Court protecting him. But anyway, we were able to discover this and report this. And we mentioned all this support the judge was receiving. Well, that's the case that I wanted to share. And I would like to make some comments related basically to the legal situation or the legal consequences. I would say that this is a case that is within all the framework of aggression to journalists. They have diversified with their, we have all types of, suffer all types of surveillance, technological surveillance, aggressions related to using money laundering techniques. Well, all these aggressions are within practices used using technologies illegally to for surveillance of journalists, to collect information, for example, information that is related to the work we do, but also with our private life. When they using when they use the intelligence law, the prosecution of the prosecutor's office is not involved. They were just military men. They were recording conversations, for example, with my kids, with my friends, with my family. And the International Pact on Agreement on Political and Civil Rights eh, established different protections, not only about information, but also the protection to the intimacy of the persons. So in this regards, this intrusion is violating different aspects. It violates freedom of expression or and our work, but at the same time, of course, it's an aggression to the intimacy of people. Intelligence exists in Chile and operates secretly, but there's no authorization to use it against civilians or journalists. Eh, Journalists investigating corruptions. It can be used to investigate corruption cases. Actually, the request for a wiretapping, the judge who gave the idea was they were listening to, or they were tapping this lady's phone because she was a Bolivian spy. So I believe that today what we need to do is decide on how the Chilean government has to take measures to avoid these types of situations. The legislation has to be updated so as not to permit these things to occur. Could you please adjust your camera? Okay, thank you. So one of the decisions was that the Supreme Court, when for example, army requests information or wiretapping, they have to provide a report. In the past, this was not the case. Judges were just authorizing without any requirement. So this is an important change that has occurred. Another aspect that is related to how we increase standards to protect journalists. Based on this case, we work with different people and we prepared a model law to protect journalists. And basically, in this law, we set forth the standards to protect journalists and people working in the press. This is relevant because, like I pointed out, the aggressions to journalists are not addressed by traditional laws. So they can violate the laws. They can violate, for example, these special protections or special guarantees that we journalists have. So do I have time to continue? How much time do I have? Like you have 10 minutes, no worries. Okay, okay, in order to continue, I think that what is really important is that we should not just be scared or be reporting only, but we have to provide or present proposals to protect journalists. There are different initiatives in Congress supported by different political and legal associations. There are different bills in Chile and in the Senate, in Paraguay too, in the Senate. And there is a recent commitment as regards the recent decision of the Inter-American Court. There's the support of different representatives in Argentina. Also, we had a meeting with the government of Brazil in order to start defining a law, also with the Association of Investigative Journalists in Brazil and in Uruguay too. Even though Uruguay is quieter, but we have had discussions with our colleagues from Uruguay. So has been an example for the whole Latin America. So this was another decision which, because we believe it is important not just to report, we need to build collectively, we have to build or create a democratic response, a legislative response from the journalists in order to address these aggressions. Of course, this is not possible in all countries in Latin America. But anyway, I believe that it is of utmost importance to do it. Something that I believe is really positive is the following. It took us several months to resort to justice because there were lots of obstacles. There was a judge involved, the army was involved, the defense ministers also had defended espionage in Congress. So basically, three powers of the state were against us. There were parliament members also defending this, the public, like TV. We had three powers practically against us. We were in a very weak situation. It was a very complex situation. And really bad things were happening. In Uruguay, today we are celebrating the Day of the Freedom of Expression. When they were celebrating the day of this freedom of expression, some people entered my home, broke into my home, but they didn't steal anything. So you cannot report because there's no evidence. But it was weird because people broke into my home, but they didn't steal anything. So we decided to make this effort. We always thought that we weren't able to advance in Chile and that we should resort to the Inter-American Court. Our discussion was whether we would be patient enough to go through this process. Finally, we were surprised because we progressed more than what we had expected, and in in a very few days, if there's no delays, in October the 15th, on October the 15th, we will start with the preliminary stages of the trial. We'll have to present evidence, and this should be solved in the first quarter in 2026, quite soon, if it is not solved earlier. So basically, this is what I wanted to point out. I believe it's a serious case. It's not a single case. There are many cases in Latin America, in Colombia, in different countries. And I believe that there is a problem because in Mexico, for example, too, because we need to be able to stop this from a legal standpoint, and we have to try to set ethical limits especially for the state when they use these technologies. But this is something we should work on. And finally, I would like to thank all the people from Colombia for their support, because, and I would like to also to thank for this debate because uh, we in Latin America have to exercise journalism that is of public interest, and in spite of all the reports of corruptions, we are really proud of this investigation because depending on the selling of copper, but every year 1.5 to 2 billion dollars go into the budget of the country, and they can be used for hospitals, for example. Thank you very much. Thank you very much for the invitation. And well, I will be here for the questions that might arise. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mauricio. Welcome, everybody joining us. Thank you so much, Mauricio, for sharing your case. It allows us to see the implications of these mechanisms of illegal espionage and follow up. And as you well said, it has to do with hashing critical journalism and to send a deterrence message to society for those that want to investigate around public relevance issues will be under the look of the intelligence services. And these practices deprive society from access to investigation around topics that directly affect people's rights to participate in an informed manner in public debate. Now we will hear from Claudia Duque. My colleague Alejandra introduced her already. She is a journalist and defender of human rights, and she's going to give us an overview of the situation in her country and the harassment, espionage processes that had to do with their work as journalists through time. Hello, good morning. Thank you, everyone, for this invitation and for this space that is so relevant for us. And that at the same time, it is so small vis-a-vis what's happening in the world these days. And I cannot start this talk without mentioning the situation in Gaza and Palestine and the humanitarian flotilla, where we have already kidnapped journalists by a genocide state. And I want to do this in this space, where in the last 2 years in the University of Columbia, there had been very serious attacks against freedom of speech or by professors, students, and even the head of the Columbia Journalist Review was fired because of one of his articles discussing the Palestinian situation. As a human being, for me, it is necessary to say these words here while we are promoting the freedom of speech globally. We cannot abstract ourselves today from what's happening in the world with humanity, what we're losing as beings, as a race. And it's important as well because it's evident that that fleet of vessels was spied, surveyed, and attacked with all sorts of technologies with the outcome that was expected in a way. And it implies what we're saying. We're being spied on, we're being attacked, and the purposes could be different, but there's always this objective, which is interrupting the possibility from the world to learn about a reality that as journalists are investigating. Now, moving into the topic, let me share my screen now with you if I'm able. Let me see where we can do that. You go to the menu, you should be able to share. I cannot see that I can share. Click on that. I only get these two options. A person can participate, can share time in advanced sharing options. I cannot do this. Maybe you're just clicking on the arrow on the left. You need to click on the in the middle. All right, so I have the option to share. Great. So if you can tell me that you can see my screen. Yes, great. Very well. So I have prepared this brief presentation because even when I'm one of the victims of espionage and torture in Colombia, quite known, what is true about the case is that this phenomena in Colombia is not at all new. And this is connected as from the very beginning of the Colombian intelligence services in our country. Seen from 1953, where the dictator Rojas Pinilla created the SIC, Servicio de Inteligencia Colombiano, and almost immediately the abuse and attacks from that body started. And the scandal was such that it included several victims, several journalists being assassinated, the head of a newspaper, for instance, which decided to have the title in the middle of the page so that header it says, "This we are uh, printing under censorship and surveillance." They were closed off. And then in Fausto, the DAS started, that is the Administrative Department of Security, that was involved with my case and so many others. In 1978, we have, by decree of President Julio César Turbay Ayala, the so-called bylaws of national security. This was a harsh dictatorship, and normally, but this was not a case of dictatorship, but it was a case of trials by civilians from on the side of military. There was military policing by the army. And with this bylaw of national security, we have the institutional practice in the army of forced disappearance and torture. We very seriously remember the attack of famous journalists. For instance, at the time, Gabriel Garcia Marquez, he was the head of Revista Alternativa newspaper. He had to go on exile, as well as other journalists, Enrique Santos Calderón, with the same newspaper, owner of El Tiempo newspaper, and espionage against famous journalists at the time that had to leave the country, that were working at El Tiempo newspaper. They were able to denounce what was happening to them, but it was not, they could not continue the work. They had to close the investigation unit at El Tiempo newspaper. In the 80s, after the Justice Palace was taken and then retaken, it happened in 1985 by the M19, and the army took over the Justice Palace, and with that disappeared and tortured several of the survivors from the taken from the what happened with the palace. And Ricardo Gámez Masuera confessed in written with a public notary delivered in Colombia before going into exile. He confessed that the intelligence brigade from the army was doing investigation and follow-ups against at least 3 journalists that were investigating what happened at the Palacio de Justicia. Víctor Yusabat from El Siglo, Alberto González from El Mundo, Jesús Cantañeda from an international news agency. In that same list, we have the name of a human rights lawyer defendants, Eduardo Umaña Mendoza, defending those killed at El Palacio, and he was murdered in 1989. In 1990, we have another scandal of illegal espionage against journalist Alberto Giraldo, and his talks over the phone illegally recorded with the heads of Cali Cartel. The Cali Cartel is a drug trafficking group that was behind even the financing of presidential campaigns at the time. There was a big scandal on this topic. And satellite offices are discovered of the DIJÍN, which is the Judiciary Research Unit, and the DAS for the illegal wiretappings. In this scandal, there was a connection with the cartels, and there was the one that was intercepted was the journalist Alberto Giraldo, who ended up in jail, and not the heads of the cartel. They were following up the journalists, not the drug lords. He had serious connections with the drug lords, and he was condemned because of this. But this opened up and discovery of illegal scaffolding within the state units between December and February 1997 and February 2001. Gaula Group intercepted more than 1,808 telephone lines of human rights defenders and NGOs. The head of Antioquia was Mauricio Santosho, who became head of security of Uribe, extradited to the US and confessing having been responsible of forced disappearance of two human rights defenders in Antioquia. Santosho should be considered to see what happened at Álvaro Uribe's government with journalists and human rights uh, defenders, as well as other assassinations. In 1999, Jaime Garzón's journalist was assassinated in August 13, one of the main journalists in Colombia, a man that was very dear to Colombia. I was a victim of espionage by DAS at, because of this. What is little that's known publicly, what's not known is that Jaime Garzón has been victim of illegal espionage by the military intelligence as from 1992. For 7 years, he was under surveillance and spied on until he was assassinated. In the year 2000, there's a first scandal on espionage and illegal wiretappings of communications inside the Administrative Department of Security, the DAS. This was totally buried, totally impugned, and we had heads of intelligence, heads of counterintelligence, very top officials from the DAS were detained, but they all were impugned. And among the victims, we had Felipe Zuleta Lleras, amongst other journalists. In 2002, 2006, around the topic of the 2000, it was so massive that the prosecutors could not find the names of all of the victims of illegal espionage by the DAS. The prosecutor says an unknown number of other victims because they could not establish the whole number of those being spied on. Between 2002 and 2006, it is the sad story that I need to discuss directly by myself. There is serious attacks and legal espionage against persons against the government of Uribe and several independent journalists, myself included here. But here we had victims of all sorts, magistrates from the courts, constitutional and Supreme Courts, union members and leaders, politicians from the opposition, congressmen and women, human rights defenders, students and student leaders. It is a gigantic barrage of more than 300 victims by the DAS at the time. Not all of them attacked the same way. I need to say that Personally, sadly, I'm one of the victims of the most serious attacks of the time. In my case is aggravated psychic torture. In 2007, 11 generals from the police, including the master Jorge Daniel Castro, had to resign because another additional scandal for illegal wiretaps to more than 200 politicians, journalists, and public officials. This is not new then, it's a repetitive practice. And from 2006 and to 2009, the DAS espionage continues, but the journalists, the victims change here. Some of us were exiled, and the structure of government and situation changed. The most serious situations faced by government were claims against human rights violation, massive detentions, hundreds of persons detained in just one raid. They were called the miracle fishings of the state. They were going for everyone in top government, top leaders, the mayors of cities, all of their teams. They were this taking over social tissue in many organizations in the country. We were investigating all these as from politics and journalism. They were under attack. We were under attack. This was opposition to the wrongly called peace process with paramilitary processes, which was a fake process in many occasions. So the view was first the scandal of the parapolitics, which were the connections of 35% of the Congress of the Republic with paramilitary, that is to say, persons that reached Congress as representatives or senators due to the bloody support of paramilitarism throughout the country. And the constitutional legal process for all these processes for the constitution that would allow the government to carry out this wrongly called peace process with paramilitary that was not allowed before. So this goes against magistrates and journalists in this case. In the year 2009, in February, there is a public claim of this scandal, the destruction of files by the Security Administrative Department, the DAS, but most of these cases end up being impugned. In February 2014, one of the big scandals is known Andromeda, a military operations center for illegal clandestine espionage with thousands and thousands of emails and phone calls from journalists that had been hacked by the office of the state called Bagley Hacker that was outside the military facilities. This was at a commercial place in Bogota, totally impugned as well. Here we say that between 2011 to 2014, the DAS is dissolved, and this takes 3 years, where in my case, we learn that the files under custody of the General Prosecutor's Office, the DAS, and the National File or Archive disappeared. More than 90 teras, 90 teras of information from 50 to 60 to 2014, where the DAS existed, disappeared, and only 54 megas ended up being obtained. This was done in the face of those that were to custody these files, and a lot of truths were then disappeared. This is totally impune. In 2013, because of the dissolution of the AS, three entities are created: Migration Colombia, the National Directorate of Intelligence, and the National Protection Unit, the UNP. In the case of the DNI, the Intelligence Unit, has been at the eye of the storm 2 years ago because of espionage to a magistrate and several oppositors. In the case of Migración Colombia, Migration Colombia, we know that there you got all of the worst from the DAS. That is, the worst for us, the best for them, the most impune. And in 2015, we see the community of the ring. The police was selling sexual services from men in the police to congressmen and people in power. In the framework of that research, several journalists were spied and attacked. This was impugned as well. In 2017, Pegasus happens worldwide with the death of Jamaica Sogi. In Colombia, we did not know about victims from Pegasus, but actually this year, yes, this year, at the beginning of this year, we learned, thanks to an investigation from Haaretz, this journalist from Israel, that Colombia paid cash, $11 million cash, they paid by Colombia for the acquisition of Pegasus. And Pegasus reached Colombia between 2020 and 2021. And to this day, we still don't know which are the victims of Pegasus, but we still have some suspicions. There is only one victim that's confirmed from Pegasus in Colombia, but clearly Pegasus was here and probably continues to act here in Colombia.
In 2018, there's another scandal known as PUMA. This is a program of legal, let's say, tapping, which is was similar to what Mauricio was said. They requested a judge to for the to authorize wiretapping because there's a weapons a smuggler, or actually there is a journalist, and this is very popular here too. But right now, considering all the new technologies, it's very easy to conduct digital espionage, and there's some kind of outsourcing, let's say, of these illegal processes because so small companies are created, formed by former members of the armed forces, just police, army, or even officers of task who form these small companies and they sell the services, let's say, privately for to conduct wiretapping, to infiltrate themselves. I was a victim myself, and I even have a testimony informing that at that time that we women in our country created a small group to report these gender-based violence and sexual harassment in the political sphere. In my country, well, I have a testimony from a person who was infiltrated, and this person apparently was paid by Álvaro Uribe Vélez. Uh, they had paid this person millions, and well, this case anyway was left unpunished. But in 2020, there was a new scandal known as the secret files or folders. This is an investigation from Semana magazine, and there's a battalion of military cyber intelligence doing profiling and data gathering against 130 persons, of which 30 were journalists, colleagues, Andrea Aldana, Alejandra Villamizar. Lots of Colombian journalists were victims, and there's only just one sanction against 9 members of the army. Really very weak sanctions. They're just 6 months suspension to exercise their positions. They are very weak sanctions, considering the implications for our colleagues. For example, Andrea is in exile right now. In 2021, and I have to speak for myself, there was a scandal that was silenced. This is a scandal of espionage by the national unit, by this other branch resulting from the spin-off of task through the GPS systems in the protection vehicles, in these schemes to protect people who were threatened. Up to that time, we were not authorized, we were not asked to authorize data gathering. And in my case, 25,000 records were found of my movements in just 3 months and during the pandemic. So imagine everything that could have happened. However, the Constitutional Court considered that this was valid, that it was not wrong to do this. So this is a battle we are fighting at an international level. I know I'm running out of time, but anyway, I would like to make a comment. The reason is not why we are being spied or who is spying us, because these questions are answered. But why are they spying us for? Well, the simplest answer and the most widespread one is that we are spied in order to silence us, to make our work more difficult, to stop our investigations, especially when they affect the different powers. Because in Colombia, we are also victims of espionage by illegal groups such as FARC or other illegal drug trafficking groups. But actually, I have seen that espionage in democratic countries or espionage against journalists is the purpose is to control us or by means of campaigns or spreading fake information in order to make us sleep. But in countries where democracy is not existent, such as in Colombia, for example, or Mexico or others, espionage is a tool to plan and to execute attacks to us. In my case, torture, but in others, threats and murders. So I believe that we need to point out that one of the main challenges are the legal processes. Mauricio said this. I thought twice before starting a legal process because this was against very powerful people. And these legal processes are very hard to hold against these powers. Usually, this is solved in favor of the perpetrators. But I have to say that I'm the only Colombian journalist under legal censorship because the judge that was conducting the case against two of these perpetrators decided in January 2019 to impose legal censorship. I cannot talk about my case in Colombia, uh, and I'm can be condemned of judicial fraud. Of course, I won't accept this, and these two people are already convicted. And well, anyway, no judge in the country was capable of repealing this order, which is still in force. And in order to conclude and to talk about legal challenges, the main challenge is impunity. I unfortunately understood that impunity is a strategy of the state in which public servants participate, military and civilians, not just the perpetrators, but also the administrators of justice, such as Mauricio was saying. There are judges, there are prosecutors, there are investigators, there are people who are really committed to remain these cases unpunished, to keep these cases unpunished. So we have to fight against huge powers. We are probably going to lose. But also there's perennial persecution. they won't leave us alone as long as we keep fighting for justice. Another challenge is that we are considered as a nuclear weapon. But why? What have I done in my life to be spied since 20 or from 2003 to 2022? Uh, I'm a nuclear threat. This is what I represent. Why are they threatened by me? And this is another legal challenge that I want to mention it. And this is the prescription of crimes against humanity. In Colombia, this was considered, but however, the International Court of Justice have established that crimes against humanity do not do not prescribe if the persons have not been identified. If they have been identified or if they are under investigation, this can prescribe. This is in favor of perpetrators, and in that regard, all my cases will remain unpunished because last year and this year, 10 years have elapsed. 1 decade in these trials that were delayed by perpetrators, delayed by a judge, the one that imposed this censorship on me, and now the Supreme Court declares that they have prescribed in favor of perpetrators. So this is a challenge and that we need to fight for our rights. And fortunately, recently, and against four of the magistrates of the Supreme Court of Justice, there was a very important decision in favor of a journalist murdered in 2013. So several legal, let's say, standards were decided so on how crimes against and attacks against journalists have to be judged. So the Supreme Court says that the perspective of censorship has to be taken into account, as well as animus silenciandi that goes together with the attacks against journalists. This is what they have to do whenever there is a case against a journalist. This is a very important decision. There were four magistrates from the Supreme Court that were against it. However, I believe that this decision has to be considered as our flagship and is really important case for us and for our colleague who will speak from a legal perspective. I think it is very important to take into account. I'm sorry if I spoke for too long, but well, I will remain here available to answer questions. Thank you, Claudia. We are doing very well with time. Thank you for this very comprehensive summary and for the history that you shared about this terrible outlook in Colombia. But this analysis can also be extrapolated to other parts of the region where the hostile contexts for journalists usually reproduce these patterns and trends. And this also is very helpful to help us understand how these espionage and surveillance mechanisms have become more sophisticated and they have become habitual practices. And I would also like to mention that we have to continue talking about Gaza. And to conclude this round of interventions, I will give the floor to our dear colleague and teammate, Juan Manuel Ospina. He will talk about international case law and regional case law in order to understand what courts are saying about this problem. Juan Manuel, you have the floor. Thank you, Estefania. Well, first of all, I would like to thank Colombia Freedom of Expression for this space, and of course, Claudia and Mauricio for speaking about these problems and the things that they have experienced personally. I will talk about, from a technical standpoint, more legal standpoint, talking about what the courts have said across the world about surveillance, espionage, and harassment to journalists. I will start by reiterating that Mauricio and Claudio have made a very clear definition of surveillance to journalists. And I would also like to mention this and the challenges posed to us. And I would like to mention that journalists are persecuted because of their dissident opinions. And this is just not an anecdote. In a survey conducted by the World of Journalism Study, for example, pointed out that approximately 4,000 journalists interviewed, approximately 27% reported of being exposed to some kind of surveillance. This is a very huge figure in any context. So this is a situation that requires a critical dimension when we observe that surveillance and harassment to journalists has become the favorite tool of authoritarian governments to suppress disagreement and accountability to states. If we accept that journalism is a fourth power, its role is to focus on issues that are of public interest, and therefore the response of other powers, the official powers, has been exactly to suppress disagreement, criticism, and accountability through these mechanisms that try to discourage those conducting these investigations. These practices deployed by executive powers in countries such as El Salvador, Venezuela, Argentina, Peru, Russia, Hungary, Belarus, China, among many others. This list is very long, but I'm just trying to point out these countries where this situation is critical really are an example of the nature of the problem. In this regard, the conclusion is unequivocal, and the response to authoritarian governments has been to shoot the messenger. So, considering this context, that has been pointed out very accurately by Claudia and Mauricio, I would like to talk about jurisprudence in order to identify some trends, common ground, and disagreements, of course, in some judicial decisions about surveillance to understand how this has been conceptualized from a legal standpoint. I will focus mainly on standards in regional courts in the world and in regional courts and across the world, clearly, and also in good practices. Claudia and Mauricio have clearly identified poor practices. And in order to be optimistic in these types of situations, I will talk about these good practices from some courts. I am not trying to do an elaborate definition of this. I will just exemplify some aspects. And at the same time, I will point out some relatively recent decisions in order to consider that surveillance to journalists has become very important, especially considering new technologies that have developed, such as the Pegasus, for example, or the data collection, massive data collection systems. For example, that's why I decided to focus on some relative recent decisions. I will talk about the Court of Justice of the European Union. Won't speak in detail about these cases. I will just mention some things. All the decisions are in our database, and many of them are translated. So if you need to analyze in detail some decisions or the legal considerations, you are welcome to consult the database. And there you will find very detailed explanations. Here, I will make a very general description. This is very relevant because different laws that were passed in France, Belgium, and the UK on data capturing by IT service operators in order to be shared with intelligence agencies other countries. These are laws that obliged the companies of internet companies or telephone companies to gather data massively from their users so that when they were requested, the security agencies had this constant communication.
These kind of laws consider obligations to gather data massively that goes against the human principle, the right to freedom of speech and the right of privacy. The court indicates that this facilitates abuse of authority as well as profiling of certain persons. And these are the words of the court. There's something that's very important to highlight here, which is that both the European Court for Human Rights as well as other courts that I was able to analyze, they do not consider any type of guarantee as for persons that could be totally immune to the surveillance of the state. And we need to say that nobody has the right of not being under surveillance by the state. So the work done by the courts had to do with considering the conditions, the ways, the context, under which that surveillance is legal or not. And this is a clarification I wanted to do because it helps us to understand the context of this debate. Now, something that's important that is highlighted by the European Court as for the intercept and massive gathering of data is the non-existence of procedural safeguards. The fact that there are no judges and these national security regulations do not consider these decisions to be reviewed by judges is criticized by the court. And this is standard that the European Human Rights Court will take again in later decisions. Let me highlight here the case of Sikus versus Hungary, Telegraph Media versus the Dutch country, Big Brother Watch, and the Sedlecka case. This has to do with surveillance and espionage against journalists, where the court establishes that the surveillance to journalists goes against or restricts rights considered in the European Convention: freedom of speech, right to privacy, as well as access to information and the protection of the sources. And I will emphasize this once again later on. I just wanted to point it out now for us to have that into account. Going back to procedural safeguards, the European Court considers the standard of saying any decision establishing any surveillance measure should be reviewed even when that can be done later or afterwards. This needs to be under some legal or judicial control. And let me emphasize here the relevance that this has as for the division of power. The executive, we have the executive power, and the judicial power has this relevant role of being the counterweight the checks and balances as for decisions restricting human rights. This has been a universal standard that was later taken by the Inter-American Court of Human Rights and their commissions, and is very much present in case law in the Human Rights European Court. Now, about other relevant standards, any decision implying the restriction of right to freedom and access to information, protection of sources needs to have three pillars. To have a legal purpose, a legitimate purpose, and this the states said this has to do with national security. This could be so ambiguous as you may want, or as specific as the state might make it so. What the courts indicated was that the protection of national security cannot be aggravated in an abstract manner. It needs to be justified by means of evidence. And uh, also, these decisions need to be necessary and proportional. For instance, to contemplate orders that are circumscribed in time or space. For instance, to carry out the surveillance of a journalist for a certain period of time. You need a duration in time, so you can question the proportionality there. There were orders, for instance, the wiretapping of all communications of a journalist instead of only thinking orders that are more circumscribed. Once again, goes against this proportionality that needs to be considered as indicated by the European Court. Protection of sources is essential. It is core to this discussion. Journalism is an exercise that happens to a larger extent to sources. Without sources, there is no journalism. And we need to highlight here that when persons know they are under surveillance and they are being wiretapped, it's clear that they cannot exert their expression in a free manner. We would all be censored if we know that most of our communications are being under wiretapping by the state and surveillance. And this is what the sources do when they decide, they consider this when they want to talk to journalists. If they don't feel safe, they will be deterred in doing so. And with that, you do not have journalism. There is no journalism without sources. And the European Court of Human Rights considered this as well. This generates a chilling effect, both in journalists as well as with sources. Without protection of the sources, there is no debate, there's no democracy that can exist in this context when the sources feel threatened. I think this is a relevant point. Now, wrapping up the European chapter, let me discuss up now case law in South Africa, which is very valuable in my view because here case law establishes certain aspects that go beyond European standards. Basically, similar cases of surveillance to journalists, this procedural safeguards that are key, and they also consider that these procedural safeguards need to exist in the framework of a judicial system being independent. There's no point in having organizations for review of safeguard measures if they are not truly independent. And I believe that this is core. And I want to emphasize this idea. Given that, considering, given that we have judges in Berlin, we'll have reasons to be optimistic that these processes of democracy will be able to prosper. I believe this is very important. And in South Africa, the court establishes this as an essential criteria. That is, judges need to be independent, and those analyzing the surveillance measures need to be independent so that the democratic deliberation can truly exist. And I wanted to briefly touch upon the case of the Constitutional Court of Duke versus UNP that Claudia mentioned vis-a-vis GPS surveillance in vehicles. This is a scandal. I'm not a fan of this decision. I think it's very problematic and controversial that the court establishes that you don't need the authorization of the protected person to to do surveillance through GPS, but there is a new concept that's important that will be taken by the Inter-American Court in the Kahar case that has to do with self-determination as for the information. In Colombia, we understood this as habeas data. The Constitutional Court in this case indicates that the persons have the right of what information the state is gathering about them to request for that deletion or transformation. And that's important because vis-a-vis these more sophisticated, stronger powers in gathering information in a massive way, for persons to be able to request from the state to delete or tell me what information they have on me, that is a sort of guarantee that facilitates transparency of these processes. Of course, it won't be an absolute response. It has to do with the safeguard of other rights, but this is a novelty standard that will be very relevant when demanding transparency from the states and transparency from the public powers. And the Cajat case, I believe it reinforces this novelty state here. We call it in Colombia habeas data. The Inter-American Court will call it information self-determination. People has a right to know what information is gathered on them. And this is a safeguard and a guarantee in favor of transparency. The Cajat case, just to give you a context, it's not a case of surveillance to journalists, but surveillance of stakeholders from the civil society. But many of their reasonings many of the cases can be translated into the case of protection to journalists. This is a milestone case in our system as for the way this surveillance is problematic. And there's another standard that I need to highlight as well, is that there's also the consideration of the relevance of judicial surveillance and the surveillance, the control needs to be prior, not later. Also afterwards, but we need that control prior. Any surveillance order needs to have both controls in a previous and prior manner. This is stronger than the standard established in the case of South Africa, as well as that of the European Court of Human Rights. I believe that we need this previous legal control that is a safeguard that is core for our system in the cases of surveillance, massive surveillance, and wiretapping and data interception. This is very important. There is a case that's very important from the Inter-American Human Rights Court. It's the case of Joanny Sanchez versus Cuba, a blogger and journalist with critical work on the regime in Cuba. And in that she was very much put under surveillance with wiretappings, etc. And this is an idea that's cross-cutting to this case law presentation. This has a paralyzing effect, a chilling effect, as it's called, on journalists. Claudia and Mauricio mentioned this, and they are living testimonies on how this has a deterrence effect in silencing critical voices. So we need to consider always this perverse chilling effect that surveillance has, even when it is not banned. There's no person, once again, that cannot be the victim of this kind of situation. It is true as well that in the legal system, you need to consider this chilling effect, this perverse effect that negatively has a negative incidence on democratic deliberation. I will leave it at this and wrap up now, considering the time we have and for leaving some time for the Q&A. Thank you so much for this opportunity and this space. Thank you so much, Juan, for this very thorough pointing to emblematic decisions that have to do with the construction of standards that took place around this topic and the good practices that came up as with these decisions. As Juan Manuel commented, all these decisions were analyzed by our team of legal investigators and are available at the Global Bank of Colombia Freedom of Expression, which link was shared a minute ago via our chat. We are now opening up some time for a Q&A, so write your questions in the chat. Together with Alejandra, we have some questions for Mauricio, Claudia, and Juan Manuel, so we can start ourselves. And as you write your questions on the chat, we'll have them answered as time allows. Anyway, you need to know that we will give you all the possibility of Mauricio, Claudia, and Juan Manuel to be able to answer to you in written if we have no time here, and we will email that to you for those registered in the webinar, and we'll be putting all the information at our web page. So Alejandra, please go ahead with the questions that we have. Very well. Thank you so much. Let me start with a question for Claudia Julieta Duque. As from a human rights point of view, in this context that we're considering of fragile democracies where journalism may seem to be less relevant because of the social media and perhaps less power with the authoritarian cases. How can we face the attacks that are happening against journalists everywhere? Well, I was listening to Juan Manuel, and I think that things are more and more complex because what he is highlighting about Privacy International against several states, I think that's a drawback. Actually, in Colombia, at least, the Constitutional Court determined that the journalists will have a reinforced protection vis-a-vis all types of legal procedures against us, which sometimes includes these topics of interception or wiretapping. In Colombia, at least legally, there is the right of reinforced protection of our freedom of speech as journalists. In the countries where you don't have democracies or the democracies are fragile or blocked, perhaps I believe the main challenge then, in my view, as for justice, has to do with this divorce between the standards, the rules and regulations, and the laws, and the little care the powerful and those in government have in complying with this. There are traps and different means being more and more sophisticated to just go over the law and regulations. So there are private companies that in appearance are private because the members are former members of the state and the armed forces trained in this type of surveillance, this outsourcing that's so difficult to pursue. And that doesn't mean that the state is surveying us, but, excuse me, she said, we have other companies that contracts and subcontracts, and this is a huge challenge in my view. And to spy on us and do surveillance is cheaper and cheaper. In the past, they had to be more imaginative, but now you can download espionage programs, and there are tutorials online to hack your WhatsApp, and anyone can access this. And also social media, where there's been an increase, a very serious increase of the loss of prestige by a profession and the hate towards journalists. So the democracies do not protect us, and the society does not consider us relevant or necessary. We are truly in a tremendous isolation as for our claims and protection. This is a tough question because it's a question that we should pose ourselves in our different contexts, and to respond to it is the measure of democracy. What do we do with this, and who cares about this, and how do we stop this? I say something. We talk about fragile democracies and social hatred. In many cases, we have earned this illegitimately, you know. And besides that, we have people and small companies and other companies that are receiving any kind of demands. They are up for the best big bidder. Surveillance is another business in capitalism now, and we have software and experts that are in abundance. So, what can we do with that? And how judges and governments, in spite of some different speeches, they end up all favoring or fostering these kind of practices? The answer I do not have as such. I just want to reflect out loud about this because it hurts very much knowing that today, as per journalists, are not respected persons in our societies. We are hated in general. And besides that, you read that on social media that uh, we are being hated. I receive 100 types of insults when things are all right per month. When things are more heated, then the number can be multiplied by 5.
So what should we do? Should we close our social media? Should we continue doing what we like? Or who is going to protect us? I believe it's a huge setback. The international court here, I would like to remind that in 2008, from this constitutional court, in my case, had already set a precedent on habeas data against task, and that court saved my life. The constitutional court said to the authorities that if there is no evidence that that person is committing an illegal act, and if there is no order in duly issued, all gathering against that journalist is illegal, and she has the right to know it. Otherwise, she has to receive it. And the GASC handed me the folders of this so sorry, to the G3, to the prosecution's office, to make them secret. And for many months, all that information about myself was kept secret. So they didn't even respect this. But this decision was setting forth that if she does not agree on her data to be collected, you cannot collect that data. And in 2022 or 2023, the Constitutional Court said just the opposite. For me to be under a protection program, there is a need for a tacit consentment that if you're protecting me, you have to know where I go to, what I do, and you have the right to record that in a database. This has not been complied fully, and in that regard, we are going against the ONP that we are more fragile. We are increasingly fragile. If the world is increasingly worse, if they don't respect international right, well, therefore, the right to protection of privacy and the right not to be harassed, okay, it's not even considered. So we will end up in this barbarian era in which we will be fighting with our hands and nails against states that are not care, taking care of the rights. And I don't have an answer for this. I just have this reflection or this comment. Thank you, Claudia, for these comments. So now there's a question for Juan Manuel. Considering the standards and the precedent that you mentioned, what element is key for a strategic lawsuit in case of surveillance of journalists? Thank you, Steffi. Well, there are several things to take into account. The legal tools are there. Standards have already been set by the different courts. Those that are set by regional courts are important, and this is a jurisprudence tells us that this court is the most progressive one. That's a starting point that has to be taken into account. And when looking for unfavorable decisions in these strategic lawsuits. However, the law is a limited tool in terms of creating transformations. Therefore, the work being done by activists and by civil society has to be the main point of contact when dealing with these issues. There is optimism, sometimes blind optimism by lawyers as a tool for social transformation, and that has to be reformulated in order to include, for example, these stakeholders from civil society. For example, having this panel formed by two journalists and a lawyer is important, is significant, and is also a testimony, a live testimony that activism has to be in sync with understanding. This legal language can facilitate these changes. I want to emphasize on an idea that Claudia introduced. This is the compliance and exercise of human rights, and this is the measure of democracy. And this won't be set by a law because there are treaties, there are conventions in Colombia and in the countries of this part of the world. We do have laws that sound good in paper, but in practice, they are not so live, let's say. If having People have to be able to live fully exercising human rights, and this is what will be a measure to determine whether we are living in a democratic society or not. And that's the general idea with which I want to answer this question. The legal language is not enough. It will always be insufficient if it is not accompanied by a strong activism by the different sectors of civil society who have to play an important role in these discussions. Thank you, Juan. So we will close this block of question with a question for Mauricio. After all these comments and reflections about your case, and apart from all the work that you've been doing with all this law to protect journalists, you not only make the surveillance visible, but also you have achieved concrete measures in order to advance in an agenda to protect journalists. So what's the impact? This is a slow journey. It will take many years, and for the next 15 or 20 years, we will have to keep on working. As Claudia and Juan Manuel were saying, democracy it's very weak, is deteriorated. There are lots of words to describe it, different concepts, but eh, democracies and hate speeches emerge and diversify, as well as aggressions. And this is related to economic power of the media. So we need to work in order to strengthen strategic legal strategies. And collectively, we have to find different ways of working for protection. This is what we discussed in a recent meeting in Buenos Aires with legal counsels from different countries. I'm quite, let's say, I'm expecting, I'm somewhat optimistic too, with the progress on this model law with the support of UNESCO and Bell Foundation. This law, like I said, is being discussed in the Chilean Senate. It is advancing, and fortunately, it has advanced rapidly in this Paraguayan Senate. It has been introduced in Argentina. We are about to introduce it in Brazil. The Our colleagues are drafting it in Peru and Uruguay too. So we are thinking on how to move forward. Of course, it is hard to think about this in Central America, for example, except for Costa Rica, but it's very hard to think about that strategy in Central America. So the protection of journalists will also be our responsibility, and we will need to work in the coming years in security, in the legislative aspects, in the education of judges, defenders. This will be hard work, anyway, very necessary. What we are experiencing, and this is what Claudia said, we are experiencing a change in the way civilization is organized. This is a productive change with the reemergence of a capitalism, as this professor say, and this forces us to rethink on the practices of journalists. And this will be a very big effort. Anyway, I want to be optimistic because in spite of the difficulties, we were able to advance a lot, but I want to preserve this advance and this solidarity. And this discussion is part of this dialogue and contribution. So thank you very much. Thank you. Mauricio, Claudia, and Juan Manuel for your really valuable interventions. And thank you all those who joined us on Zoom and YouTube. We hope that this debate can be useful to make the risks journalists face visible, but that this discussion can help us think about concrete actions to strengthen the actions facing this problem. This webinar will be saved in, and you will find it in YouTube in Columbia Global Freedom of Expression. And if you haven't registered to our weekly newsletter, we invite you to join in order to receive information about new events, advances in terms of decisions in our bank of global jurisprudence, and also about our projects. I have shared the link on the chat, and thank you once again. Have a great day. Goodbye.